Welcome to the next Renaissance with Ramayan and Samir. We're in the midst of a massive transformation on the planet. We're witnessing market capitalism testing the limits of Earth's resources, the dangers of climate change, and the unraveling of political and social institutions that gave us stability. These all pose existential risks to our civilization that we cannot ignore. At the same time, we're witnessing a flourishing in consciousness, a revival of the arts as a vehicle for awakening, the emergence of technological breakthroughs that have the potential to transform our economy, and the dawning of new systems experiments. Are we in the midst of the next Renaissance? Come discover on this podcast. Welcome back, everybody, to the next Renaissance. And in this episode, we're going to speak a little bit more around the economy itself, because the economy almost means management of the household. And the economy has become the de facto systems organization of our world today. Our entire world is organized, operated, and oriented around serving this thing we call the economy. Mm-hmm. And at its root, unless we're able to shift some of the fundamental principles of how we operate as a household or as a planet, our planet as our household now, we may not make it through to the next epoch of our civilization. Yeah. So we're at this moment, and we're the next Renaissance. We're asking, what is the next economy? What does it look like? But we can't really get to that question unless we have a deeper understanding of how did we get here. And so maybe, Zam, take us a little bit into the history of economics, since you did study spiritual economics in school as a degree. Where are we now, and how did we get here?
Yeah, I think it's really cool that you said management of the household, and to just even give a little bit of a deeper understanding where that comes from. The etymology is that, you see economos, economy, right? Mm-hmm. And in the Greek, it's oikos nomos, right? Which means management of the household, which was a subset of oikos logos, which becomes ecologos, which becomes ecology.
Interesting.
Right? So the economy is the management of the home, and the ecology is the management of the larger environment. And that they're not meant to be separate from each other. But what we've done is we've disconnected, right? The way in which
they seem to be at war with each other now.
Exactly. Where truly the way in which we manage our own individual lives should be in right relationship to and in connection to the larger biosphere that houses us. It was already implicit in our language, in our etymology, and the way in which we've divorced that has been at our peril, as we can clearly see now. And as a result of our current capitalist system, we're facing the threats of existing without a recognition of what our planetary limits are.
So just to tap into that for a second.
Yeah,
I think it's really fascinating that at the age of 18, 19 years old, you chose and embarked upon a study, because you took a Gallatin in NYU, right? And Gallatin, you can design your own major, and you chose spiritual economics, which fundamentally means that you saw a connection between the two. Otherwise, you wouldn't have chosen that as your major. So I'm really curious to see, what do you see as the connection point between spirituality and economics? I know we were talking about the history of economy and how did we get here, but I think it's really relevant that we speak about this, because you're speaking about economy being embedded in ecology. And there was a divorce and a split.
Yeah.
And that divorce and split has to mirror some sort of inner divorce and split.
Yeah,
on some level,
I mean,
right?
To be completely honest, I didn't see a connection between spirituality and economy. That's kind of what irked me. All I knew is that something was wrong, something was off, and I didn't know what it was, to be completely honest. I was like, I don't know what it is, but this doesn't feel right. When I was doing my first years in undergrad, I would have arguments with my professors in micro and macroeconomics class, where I would challenge the assumptions of the model, because when you're learning economics, this is the model and here are the assumptions, and when I would question that, the professor would be like, listen, if you're questioning the assumptions of the purpose of this model to begin with, why are you here? Because you can't question those assumptions. And that really made me think, why am I here then? Because I don't agree with the assumptions of this kind of ivory tower economics model.
What didn't you agree with?
Well, I mean, that the sort of rationalized self-interest of human beings, the reduction of us to basically being seen as cogs in a wheel and as consumers, or reducing everything to basically formulas. Um, the understanding that the good of the individual and of the nation was premised on economic growth, the increase of GDP, of GDP per capita. And that sort of dovetailed with my study of international relations, and primarily that came into contact with game theory, where basically you have these independent actors that would pursue their interests at the expense of another, and that it was essentially a zero-sum game, and that it was one in which, you know, you basically had to, it was kind of like a chess match where you had to kind of outsmart your opponent and realize that if you didn't take action first, that they would then take that action. That essentially it was a rivalrous competitive dynamic, and for me that just didn't seem like that was not the kind of international relations political reality that I thought was the kind of one that we should be inhabiting as humans. Yes, it is grounded in many ways in how we do behave as human beings, but I felt like if we're just going to get better at the same old game that isn't good for us and isn't working, that's not what I'm into. And I felt that way with international relations and with the study of economics. And as I began to go deeper into, well, why is it this way? And has it always been that way? That took me into history. And that took me to understanding and trying to study other cultures. And has it always been this way in other cultures? Because it is a pretty Eurocentric worldview, right? And so, you know, to give a little bit of history of economics and capitalism, I mean, long story short, you know, capitalism is pretty new on the scene, and, you know, it's a few hundred years old. Right? Before that, we were feudalistic societies that were ruled by a noble class. There was very little upward mobility. It was mostly serfs on the land. There was few individuals who would own the land, and they would be able to pass this wealth on generationally that was connected through bloodlines. But, you know, people couldn't start up a business. You know, I mean, we're looking at monarchies. This is not even, you know, really functioning democracies. And so that's where we came from. But there started to be there was a confluence of forces. One was a lot of global trade that started to happen, particularly the silk trade routes and the bringing of silk and spices and jewels and these things coming over, and nobles wanted to be able to buy that. So the merchants started to have more power because they had a lot of things that people wanted. And it also dovetailed with the development of what we might call, like, you know, modern industry and capital. It started with the development of the cotton mills, right? Where, you know, you had large scale machinery that was able to produce high volume of goods. And in order to keep that machine fed, you needed to be able to guarantee a continuous supply of the factors of production. So if we just go to cotton, basically, well, what do you need? You need a continuous supply of labor, and you need a continuous supply of cotton. And to get that cotton, you need to be able to, you know, steward land to be able to do that. And so you need to be able to commodify the basic factors of production. So that means you need to be able to buy land, and you need to be able to buy labor, right? And you need to be able to buy the capital equipment in order to ensure that this, you know, industrial model works. So there was sort of an agreement that started to be made between the merchants and the nobles, and it was called the enclosure movement. And essentially, for the first time, power started to shift in the hands of the merchants because, like I said, there's something that they had that the nobles really wanted, which was money, more money, to be able to generate more and more money to buy more and more things that, you know, these consumer items that were coming from these exotic countries. And so all of a sudden you had what was called the commodification of the factors of production. From the first time, you start to disembed these things that had always been embedded in the social structure out, so that a market system could take place. So you could, you know, buy people, and you could buy land, you could buy these other factors of production. and you had to keep a continuous stream of that. And that's significant. That was a huge shift in the way that we oriented our economies.
Mhm.
Now, this is also coinciding with the rise of Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations, talking that there's an invisible hand, and that by each individual pursuing their own rational self-interest, that they would actually work in a concerted way for the good of the whole system, and that we should encourage this.
It's a doctrine of self-interest, essentially the invisible hand of capitalism.
Yes, exactly, right? And that there was this invisible hand that would ensure that, needs and wants would be met and would be balanced, and that, these forces of supply and demand would ensure that there would be a balance within the economy, that didn't really need the control of external political forces. This was the ideal, right? This like laissez-faire
capitalism.
economies, exactly. Of course, we realized a bit later on that, of course, that doesn't work, and that's not how it is. But, I think the most important thing to note is that what we had was that, before, when, a market was something that you would just go to, like you go to your market fair, like, on the island, or, you go to, the market to like buy goods and services, and people's social relations are being affirmed and supported within the market. Now the market was abstracted outside of society, right? It's something that is the market. We're always literally, we're in the market. Before, the market happened inside the social relationship, right? Everybody would, when we go to, we live on Salt Spring Island, you go to Salt Spring Island, when does everybody hang out? They go to the market, they meet people, they find out what's going on, there's music, the craftsmen meet, everybody's like buying, sharing, exchanging, trading. This is embedded within the society. Now, the market had to get disembedded from society. And in fact, in order for capitalism and a market system to work, society had to be reorganized so that it was always available to serve the needs of the market. And in industrial society, it means to serve the needs of a machine. Mm-hmm. And the machine, unlike a human, never stops.
Never sleeps.
It never sleeps. It keeps running. So all of a sudden, everything needs to be perpetually available to serve the needs of the machine. Think about what that changes in our psyche, right?
This is really important, you guys.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to get you to repeat this one more time. Because I just think that what you just said is, like, I don't think a lot of people think about or understand the difference between the market being embedded in a community and the relationships that thrive when you need to go to the market to buy food and groceries from somebody and be with your artisans, and your actual needs and wants are being embedded inside of your society, inside of your culture, and then abstracting that out and the commodification of everything.
Exactly, because all of a sudden, land is embedded in place in relationship to the ecology. All of a sudden, that has to be reduced to a number value, so that it can work in a market system.
Yeah.
Labor is really actually people's life energies going into crafts and working. All of a sudden, that has to be reduced to a number value that needs to be perpetually available, right? You have to disembed it from actual social relationships.
And you're seeing more and more everything that was non-commercial become commodified. Right? All the things where you'd go over to your neighbor's house and just help them fix something, now you one-click order that on your phone for somebody who you don't know to come and do that. And now you don't need anybody anymore. And I actually made a music video about this called We Need Each Other, because I was seeing, wow, we in the West think that needing each other is something awful, and that we look down upon the fact that we need anybody, and we do everything we can to create an island around ourselves so we don't need anybody, yet we feel more isolated, more alone, more disconnected, more lonely. I mean, in Vancouver, they did a study of what was the biggest problem that people in Vancouver were facing. And it wasn't, the issues of housing or drugs. It was the fact that people are lonely. People feel disconnected. So I'm really curious to how much this disembedding of the market from society is perpetuating this feeling of aloneness, that, wow, I don't know my neighbors because I've given myself no reason to know my neighbors. I don't need to ask them for anything.
Well, if everybody has to buy their own saw, it's great for GDP.
Exactly.
right? I mean, the more that
Right?
you are
Isn't this insane?
the more that society is disconnected and disembedded for each other, the more that you have to turn towards businesses to provide the needs that otherwise were provided by society. I mean, we don't value a lot of these things anymore. I mean, look at what happens with childcare. Like in a village system, you're not paying for childcare, right? I mean, the rise in mental health. I mean, we're finding so much of it is due to the breakdown of social relationships and experience of isolation. Well, I mean, that happens to work great for pharmaceutical companies, right?
It's
Like
so true.
everything that
It's
was
horrible.
once
It's so true.
provided was once provided by culture and by society. The more that we get disconnected from that, the more that it serves the economic engine and machine, right? So there's a perverse incentive here to maintain that isolation and disconnection.
That's huge, man. That's tragic. And I think this is where you're finding this rebellion. Like, people are rebelling against Big Pharma. And they're rebelling against the nature of the economies today. I mean, so many people in our culture are talking about what does it mean to re-village? What does it mean to re-inhabit the village? What does that even mean? And it's not just about going to another place and just buying a piece of land and trying to create some proto-community, even though that's beautiful. We have to bring that and re-embed that here in all the ways that we live. I was thinking about this when I was living in English Bay in 31-floor apartment building, and my cousin Zubin would go in every elevator ride, and he would go to try to meet everybody and connect with everybody. And I would watch people's reaction as he would just say hello and greet people and make an attempt to create some sort of re-social embedding. And it was so awkward and difficult for so many people to feel that sense of connection. And I remember when we were going to knock on doors to try to borrow a pan to use for one of our baking things, and the act of that, none of the people in our entire building had never had anybody knock on their door and ask them for anything before. And it's these little things, it's the little big things.
Yeah.
And it always struck me, I'm like, wow, we have an entire apartment floor building with 15 apartments. There's 15 microwaves. There's 15 vacuum cleaners. There's 15 stoves. There's a 15 sets of everything. And that's exactly what you're saying. That serves the machine. Imagine if there was just one shared unit that had so many of the appliances and things that we need. And so I think we are starting to see the dawn of the sharing economy. You're starting to see things like carpooling apps, and you're starting to see shared workspaces. Yeah, as an example, where we are in right now,
Yeah.
of saying, wait a second, we don't actually all need everything.
Yeah.
Actually, there can be a way that we can re-embed some of this social architecture back in, but that is very much at odds and threatens the market economy.
Well, in order for that to happen, there had to be some major psyops, some big psychological operations in order to produce the kind of consumer that would feed the economic machine and engine, right? Because think about it, like I said initially, okay, you have the nobles that are benefiting and buying stuff, but there's only X number of those. Most people are not. So you have to literally create a consumer class, right? I mean, marketing, something that really in the last 100 years has evolved, right? I mean, prior to that, you didn't have a huge marketing engine. So people have to identify themselves as consumers. It also rose with what Max Weber calls Protestant ethic and spirit of capitalism, which is that, our sense of favor in the eyes of the creator, but also our sense of value is dependent on how much that we are able to produce and generate through a hard work ethic that got deeply instilled. But in addition with that, this notion of keeping up with the Joneses, that you want to be able to have as much as the person next to you. But first and foremost is that people have to see themselves as consumers. Right? You have to see yourself as your kind of purpose is to buy, because in the fulfilling the purpose as a consumer, you're working for the social good, and it's also going to provide for your happiness, right? This was not something that was prevalent pre-capitalist economies. People didn't identify themselves because they didn't have purchasing power. Think about it. It wasn't existent. So well, it had to be, you had to literally shift a mindset in order to even think that way and to become consumers.
But there's two arguments in this, and I wouldn't even say they're arguments, is that the emergence and the dawn of capitalism created a incredible new standard of living for billions across the planet. It rose people out of poverty and living as feudal serfs and created an entirely new possibility for civilizational architecture. And so I feel like capitalism in many ways has served an amazing purpose.
Yeah.
It has brought us forward into a new type of society that is a lot more equal. And even though we still are facing massive inequalities as a society, I can say quite happily that the lives that we live now are probably just as good as nobles would live, if not better, in their day. And that there is so much more opportunity for social mobility. And there's an ability to be able to determine your future in a much different way than there ever was before. So those are the benefits in many ways of capitalism.
Yeah.
Right? The increase in comfort, the extended lifespan that we have. I mean, how much longer we're living these days. So how are we able to appreciate some of the benefits that capitalism brought us? And what is the kind of pivot point of transformation look like now, where we can move beyond the game of extraction at all costs into re-embedding the market back into social architecture? What does that look like? And I know we can't go into the whole picture right now, but maybe even at an overview level, we can look at it.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I want to just say is that I completely agree that the evolution of a market economy and capitalism did help to break down a lot of barriers that separated people for being able to access innovation, creativity, to be able to become socially mobile. A lot of things have emerged out of that. That being said, there's a lot of flaws in the assumptions behind a capitalism and market society. And I think one of the ones that's, let's say, a myth, and one of the myths is that it really is going to lead to a reduction in inequality. There's a book called Capital by Pinkerty, which is a huge tome of a book, and if you want to wade through it, power to you. But he's shown that really inequality has actually only been growing in the last 100 years. The trickle down effect is basically a myth. It's like a pee down effect, like the wealthy are just kind of urinating on the masses of the population. Like, wealth continuously is sucked up and it stays up there. And the reason is because within a capitalist economy, the surplus is taken out of circulation. It's removed from circulation. Now, if the more surplus that we generate gets removed from circulation, then it's not going to enrich and benefit the whole. Whereas when we think of gift cultures and gift economies, what you do is you pass surplus back into circulation. That's the kind of shift that we're going to need. We're going to need to shift to more of a gift-based mindset. And when I say gift, I don't mean necessarily giving everything away. It means that we have to understand what reciprocity is. Because that brings us back into economics and ecology, management of the household and management of the environment. So long as, if you look at the way capitalism works, is that it takes something that was developed and labored upon by the earth for thousands, millions, hundreds of millions of years, extracts it, benefits from it, and then takes that surplus and removes it from the cycle. And if we continue to do that, we destroy the very life support systems that we have. And that's what we're seeing right now. So we have to understand deeply what reciprocity is and ask ourselves, are we in a reciprocal relationship with our environment and with each other? So I think the question is really, how do we make this shift in reciprocity?
Beautiful reframe. It's interesting you mentioned that, because I think the beautiful perspective you come from is studying the nature of the gift. what is a society rooted in reciprocity and how do we achieve that? And for myself, I've been working really deeply in the blockchain space and working in DAOs and working in the emergence of decentralized autonomous organizations. And for those on this podcast who don't really know anything about any of these things, for the first time, we have a technology with blockchain which creates a system of accounting where you don't need a centralized intermediary in order for me and you to have a transaction. I don't need to go to a bank and trust the bank's ledger and be able to give all my money to this bank, which then sucks that surplus up, lends 10x leverage on it, and creates a lot of the insane problems we have in our society because of the nature of the banking system, which does exactly what you say. And with blockchain, me and you can have a direct transaction.
Yeah.
And we have our wallets and we have our keys, and we're able to generate our own value, i.e. our own token, call it whatever you want, and we can have an exchange. So the benefit of that is that we can create new structures where the collective can start to pool our assets together inside of new commons infrastructures and operate businesses more as a community, rather than having corporations, which are usually started by a handful of people, which control most of the capitalization table, which exists to embed inside of a market capitalistic structure that seeks to simply extract and give the wealth to the handful of a few. And what I'm seeing and witnessing in the birth of these decentralized autonomous organizations is founders, people who have their creativity, their technology, willing to give and embed that inside of a much larger social architecture where they're willing to take a much smaller percentage of the surplus in order to allow the collective to generate and manage that surplus. And that is really interesting because you're allowing and you're trusting the collective to govern the treasury and the assets together.
But I thought that one of the premises of the whole crypto model is that it's sort of like a trustless transaction system that you don't need to trust.
Well, you do need to trust, okay? And this is the misnomer. In order for me and you to send a transaction, I don't need to trust a bank, right? I send the transaction to a blockchain. Everybody who holds a copy of that blockchain on their device can validate that that transaction is real. There's a whole validation process. And once it's validated in a completely decentralized way, it gets updated across all ledgers and me and your transactions get validated. And now every ledger gets updated saying, now the new balance is X for me and X for you. And that's universal across all.
So what's the
devices.
Trustless aspect of it?
That is the trustless aspect. That you don't need to trust another individual. It's not about me and you trusting each other. It's about
you trust
us,
the whole system.
You trust the entire system.
Okay.
Exactly. And the entire system has a fail-safe mechanism where unless 50% of people control the essential blockchain, if it's distributed enough on enough computers, it's almost impossible to take over, which is why even to this day, Bitcoin has never been hacked because it's distributed enough. So you're trusting the collective, you're trusting the distribution across a wide variety of systems. Now that is just Bitcoin. The emergence of DAOs is the evolution of what I see as the cooperative. Right? In cooperative economics versus capitalistic economics, cooperatives look at how do our relationships affect all of the members inside of our cooperative. It's not dictated by just a handful of people. Cooperatives, by their nature, are able to receive votes of membership of who should be in power. Everybody in leadership and everybody on the board of cooperatives are voted in by the people. And all the people who hold membership shares in those cooperatives are able to exercise their voice and are able to receive the distribution of surplus from a system as a collective. So the surplus isn't just siphoned to the top of a handful of shareholders. The surplus is truly distributed amongst a collective.
So my understanding is that blockchain is try to democratize finance, right, in a way that has been previously held in the hands of whatever the financial elite or the people that know about how to use that system. And that currently the challenge is that it's built upon things that don't currently have actual tangible value yet.
Agreed.
So while the idea is excellent,
some of it.
Okay, but while the idea is excellent, it has to be translated to things that we're actually like using and exchanging, right? Rather than being abstracted further from our normal exchanges, right, in products and services and things like that.
I agree, and this is because
It's still speculative.
it's very speculative, and
Yeah.
most of the tokens are, because most of the crypto we see today are tokens that have been created in the same model of capitalism that produced them. Right? There's still a lot of them built to be able to extract value and extract wealth. And most of the tokens that exist are functioning for the utility of a protocol or a piece of technology, because we're so young. Technology is only 12, 13 years old. So much of what's being developed is on a technological level. Where this is going to go in the future, where this is really good, the rubber is really going to hit the road, is when the tokens represent community assets rather than protocol assets in technology.
Yeah.
And we haven't quite got there yet.
So I think this, let's stretch it out a little bit. So, and you tell me if you see a future in this. So, the Davos Economic Forum, behind the scenes, they are trying to work with and start partnering with the United Nations to start having seats for corporations within the General Assembly. And the premise is that in the world that we're going into, there's going to be a great challenge into how we steward the commons. Like, just water, air, basic resources, all the things that that everybody needs to use, and that corporations are the largest users and stewards to some degree of these, and that they need to have a seat at the table, right? And so you're saying blockchain can bring about a different way of thinking about how, as a collective, we steward the commons. So instead of corporations having what Davos is calling it is multi-stakeholder capitalism, right? Yeah. And so what are your thoughts on this idea of they're presenting it as a more inclusive and diversified way of capitalism, but it seems more of a Trojan horse to get corporations at the seat of the table where they're more on parity with governments, right, in an official sense, to steward the commons when we already know what their true motivations are.
Well, I mean, let's just look at the fact that Davos is a gathering of economic elite. So what do the economic elite want? More power. So by giving them the seat, I mean, they already got the first seat of power when you said that you have the rights of an individual, the rights of a human in the court of law. Right? That was huge. By giving corporations essentially personhood, you allowed them to be able to sue people to sue them, and them to be immune, and the people behind them to be immune from the decisions they make. That can be hugely problematic. Now, what didn't we do? We didn't give nature those rights. So now the corporation has the right of personhood and can sue in court. The river can't sue in court. The trees can't sue in court. The forests can't sue in court. And so the indigenous, who have been fighting for the stewardship of rivers, of the forest, who have been embedded in that value system of ecology, have had no real voice. Now, for the first time, you're starting to see certain places that are embedding the rights of nature and giving legal rights. And in Chile, this year, put the rights of nature inside of their new rewritten constitution. In Quebec, they just made a river for the first time have legal rights. And if you dump in the river as a corporation, the river can sue you. And its constituents are indigenous leaders and environmental activists who have been working on behalf of those rights for a long time. Now, this is fascinating, right? So rather than embedding corporations even deeper into the nation state needs to re-embed the laws and the rights of nature to become the bulwark against corporate interests. Because, and I think this is one of the most significant things that we can do at this time, is if we do say that corporations and capitalism are pushing nature and ecology to the extent, the only way we can rebalance that is by giving rights back to the ecology. Because, as you said, we're in a world of multipolar traps. And multipolar traps mean that if one country or one corporation says, yeah, we're going to do way better for the environment, and we're not going to do X and X and X, another country and another corporation is going to leap upon that, not have the same safeguards.
Yeah, if someone says, I'm not going to fish in this part of the ocean because I want to protect the ocean, the other guy's like, fine, I'll fish in there and I'm going to make more money and it'll be good for my country,
Exactly.
right? If you ain't going to cut down these trees, fine, but I'm going to find a way to cut down the trees.
You got it.
So, that's where we're at.
So that's one of the great multipolar traps we have, and the reason why we're not able to actually effectively move forward on climate change. And why corporations and the nature of unchecked capitalism that we have, meaning capitalism and growth at all costs. The problem we have is being able to set environmental limitations. And the biggest asset that we have is actually the court of law. And if we're able to embed rights of nature, then what that does is it internalizes externalities. And so maybe you can share a little bit around externalities so I can explain that a little bit.
I mean, it just means that, externalities are basically the problems that we don't have to deal with. Like if you're a factory and you are having effluents that you then dump into a river and then downstream that affects people's water supply or creates health effects, that's an externalization of the cost. Right?
Why is it an externalization?
It's externalization because you don't take it into account and you don't have to be accountable to it.
Exactly.
So long as you have a system that says, well, you don't have to be accountable to the whole, but only to your particular interest, then basically the rest are costs that someone else has to bear.
You got it.
And that's the economy that we have now. We externalize everything because it's not an inclusive mindset.
Exactly.
Which is inconvenient. It's the inconvenient truth, which is that you have to include the whole. And it's a challenge for us to be able to do that.
And so part of this next renaissance is, how do we internalize externalities? Meaning, how do we re-embed the market back in society? I mean, it goes back to the same question that you were asking, or same problem you were addressing in the beginning. And there are certain solutions. Giving nature rights, I believe, is one of the largest solutions. And I'm excited to bring people like Vandana Shiva onto this podcast, who's one of the great leaders of rights at nature right now in the world. She's amazing, right? So what are other solutions like this, which, while not maybe fully meeting the ideal of post-capitalism, which I do believe that people like DAOs, structures like DAOs, are starting to reimagine. But structures like DAOs are on the fringe. They're on the very edge. They're on the cutting edge of the next economy, the new value systems, the new technological architectures, and they are a very, very small subsegment right now of the population that are willing to put in the time, energy, and work to learn these very advanced ways of governance and cryptography and wallet setups and shared governance modeling in order to model new systems of how we reimagine the commons. But as in the bridge of that, you said earlier, we don't necessarily have the time. So what can we do now that's able to provide a bulwark against the worst forces of unchecked capitalism and is not necessarily giving corporations the same seat at the table as nation states? In fact, it's the opposite. It is nation states banding and creating unified agreement frameworks for how we price in externalities. And carbon credits are just the beginning of that. It's the very like corporate, sprinkling of the dust.
It's the greenwashing of it.
Exactly. It's the greenwashing of it.
But it's hard for human beings to change, right? And I think that also brings us to the question of culture, because I think there's always been this dialectic between culture and consciousness. I would say consciousness and structures, right? Is that, there's always great revolutionary thinkers that say, we got to change the structure, and if we change the structure, everything will be better. But if we don't have the requisite consciousness to inhabit that structure and to actually employ it correctly, it never really takes root. It doesn't make the effect. So on a cultural level, we need to have a shift that says, no, we can't. We need to create and inhabit these structures, right? And that culturally we are prepared. We are building the social and cultural supports so that we can transition and actually effectively utilize these new structures. I think a great example is in the crypto space. There's a lot of hype and excitement around Web3 and blockchain, but what you see playing out is the same competitive, Darwinian, capitalistic economic dynamics that fly in the face of the more idealistic, cooperative promises of what this technology could offer.
Fully agree.
So unless
it's almost hyper-capitalism.
Exactly. So unless the consciousness shifts, we're not going to steward the technology in the direction of the good of the whole. And I think, again, this is one of the narratives of Davos, which is that we're entering into the fourth industrial revolution, and that this is a time where we are going to have a exponential increase in the power of technology. And, I like what Schmachtenberger says, which is that if you have the power and technology of gods, you need to have the wisdom and compassion of gods as well to steward it, right? Something to that effect. And so that's part of the challenge, that we need to enhance our ethics. We need to develop social intelligence and emotional intelligence, intellectual intelligence, somatic intelligence. We need to develop soft skills and collaboration and in teamwork and communication that is going to support us to steward this technology that we are developing regardless of whether we're prepared to use it for the good or not. Like, it's going to happen. Synthetic biology is the avant-garde. That's the next forefront, where we're going to merge machines and biology in ways that we've never seen before. Artificial intelligence is emerging in ways that, if we don't know how to program and use it with ethics in the correct way, could actually be very harmful to human beings. So it's an urgent question right now as to, how do we do that? And I think for another podcast to explore the role of education in this, I think would be really, really fascinating to explore.
Yeah, I think so too. Well, I think that's a really good cap to this episode. Thank you, everybody, for being with us. We hope you got a lot of value out of this conversation, and we look forward to diving deeper on some of these topics in the next episode of The Next Renaissance.
Thanks, Ram.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Sam. Thanks for listening, family. The fastest way to accelerate the next Renaissance is to share ideas that matter. If you found this to be valuable, please consider taking 15 seconds, pressing the follow button, and sharing this with somebody that you feel will benefit from it. If you think someone needs to be on this podcast with us, send us a DM and let us know. Until next cast.